Well, I bring cupcakes to make sure you're in a good mood. All right. Yes, that is interesting that in the past I have reviewed historical fiction books, and I started out, the first book I reviewed was a historical fiction book, and I was like, you know, I really like just flat out history better. And but I've loved the books, the historical fiction books I've read for The Circle. And then I thought, gosh, well, be careful what you wish for, because then you're going to get it. Pure history. And it was really good. Okay, so the book is The President and the Freedom Fighter, and we can't overlook the subtitle, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Their Battle to Save America's Soul, written by Brian Kilmeade. And it's also interesting how you mentioned the research I do for the books that I review, and I usually have a process when I present a book here, and what I do first is read the book, and then I watch interviews with the author. I just love doing that. And then, and the authors will often give insight on their writing process or what they found interesting about the topic or why they picked the topic. Then after that, I look up book reviews to see if there are any critical thoughts that I could share. But with this book, I had to use a totally different process, because what happened is first I looked for interviews with Brian Kilmeade, and I couldn't really find interviews related to the book. Now, as you know, he's a journalist. He's on TV and radio daily, so he had a strong presence on the internet, but I could not find an interview where he just sat down and talked about this book. I was hopeful once, because I found on YouTube an interview that was from a Kentucky book festival where he was promoting the book, and it showed that it was 30 minutes long, so I thought, okay, that is going to be good. So I started watching, and he talked about the book in a very cursory way for about 5, if even 5 minutes, and then it turned to question and answer. And then from there, everyone was like, well, tell us about the news, and tell us about like Ainsley Earhart or whatever her name is. And so then from there on, like, he didn't mention anything about the book. So that was not helpful. And then I went to look for book reviews, and I really could not find one book review on this book. And you'd think for a New York Times bestseller that there would be book reviews, and I work at UTSA, so I even asked the librarian, like, could you search the UTSA database to find a book review, and she couldn't find one. Now, maybe they exist, and we just were not looking in the right place. But anyway, so I was like, okay, well, what am I gonna do? Okay, now, just yesterday, I thought, really, is there nothing out there? And I did find on YouTube like a 6-minute discussion that Brian Kilmeade had on the Huckabee Show, and I'm going to share some of that insight. But you know what? And I didn't even watch all 6 minutes, I have to say. And in retrospect, I was glad that I didn't hear that until after I read the book and prepared what I was going to say. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so my question was, you know, what am I going to do? I needed a new process. I teach rhetoric at UTSA, and so I decided to go to my textbook, and with my students, we always review this chapter on how to analyze the rhetorical situation of an article, a book, anything. And there are 4 questions that you can start to ask yourself when trying to figure out the rhetorical situation. And in my class, like every few weeks, I will say to my students, what's the first question you ask in evaluating the rhetorical situation? Often, seriously, there's silence. And I'm like, really? We've been over this before. But anyway, and you all could probably do better, but we'll see. Okay, the first question is, who is the author? And so what do we know about Brian Kilmeade? And by the way, that is a very important question to start with any time. Who is the author? Especially in this day and age where I am guilty of getting my news on Facebook or like Yahoo News. And sometimes wherever I find my news, I'll read an article and I'll think like, who wrote this? And and then I do a tiny bit of research. I'm like, okay, well that explains why it says what it says. But anyway, that's beside the point. What do we know about Brian Kilmeade? He has a website, so that was easy to learn about him. He has a bachelor's degree in communications from Long Island University. Right after that, he got into the news in LA and sort of worked his way to Fox News. So according to his website, he's on the air for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, as a host of Fox and Friends. And then he also is the host of a nationally syndicated radio show, The Brian Kilmeade Show on Fox News Talk. He has written 6 books, and really, like, how does he find the time to write 6 books? But I guess he has. And 4 of them are history books: George Washington's Secret Six, Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates, Andrew Jackson and the Miracle of New Orleans, and Sam Houston and the Alamo Avengers, and then this one. I think 1 or 2 of those books he co-wrote, but this one is all him. His website says that combining all sales, the books have been bought by over 2.5 million readers around the world and counting. In the interview that I saw yesterday on the Huckabee Show, Brian Kilmeade said that Fox helps him get the word out and really sell those books. So that's good. Good for him. Okay, now the next question in thinking of the rhetorical situation is who's the intended audience? Who are the readers? And so, I thought a little bit about that. How would you describe the audience for this book? I would describe the audience as non-experts. It is not an academic audience, I don't think. And why I say that is we've all read history books that are more focused for an academic, scholarly audience that is more dense, harder to get through, and that does not describe this. I think it's a good general audience. It's readable, it's short and concise. In his acknowledgments, Kilmeade thanks the president of the publishing company for, quote, helping to hone the concept of the project into a fast-moving, reader-friendly book. And I think that's what it is. It's funny because I would read a little bit of this book every night. It was taking me forever. And finally, my nice husband looked at me and he was like, why is it taking you so long to read that book? I read it in like 2 days. I'm like, I know. Well, I read it at bedtime and I read like 2 pages at a time. Another thing, when you look at the book, it's very reader-friendly because of the headings. I don't know if that's how I read it. Like, I would just read the next heading at a time. And so I think it's reader-friendly for a general audience, not too scholarly or academic, although very well researched. I don't mean that in a negative way. Actually, I probably mean it in a positive way. The next question, in evaluating the rhetorical situation, what is the author's purpose in writing the book? I would say his purpose was just to educate readers, to provide a general overview of these 2 men and the Civil War. So many Americans today don't know our history. Have you all seen any of those cringe-worthy man-on-the-street interviews where they ask people, like, how many states are there in America? And, I mean, I can hardly watch those. So anyway, we could all stand to learn our history a little bit better. But in the acknowledgement section, Kilmeade states his purpose. He said, I wanted to tell a Civil War story that didn't further divide the nation while confronting the horrific era of slavery. And in that same Huckabee interview, he said he wanted to show where these 2 men came from and how they came together. That was a very interesting perspective, seeing them sort of side by side, and it took many years for them to meet. In the interview, he also discussed a more political purpose of the work, and he stated that, quote, people are trying to blow up the American dream. And he mentioned how some people are trying to remove Lincoln's name from schools. And so I heard, those are the comments I heard just yesterday. So probably, if I went back to YouTube and found more interviews, he would probably have more comments with, like, politically what he was trying to do with this book, but honestly, I'm glad that didn't like influence my reading of the book. I just thought it was a really good, clearly written telling of this important part of history. Okay, and the next question in rhetorical situations, so we've looked at who's the author, who's the audience, what's the author's purpose, and the last question we're going to look at is how are sources used here. And he used sources that highlighted Lincoln and Douglas's voices and words. I really like that. I like it when a historian lets the people speak for themselves, and I think he did a really nice job here. His list of sources was long. There were footnotes, there were endnotes of interest throughout the book. I think his use of sources builds his credibility. And then he also had that section at the end for further reading, which was an extensive list. Okay, so that helped me get a better handle of the book in general, thinking about the rhetorical situation. And then the other thing I did to prepare was I watched an interview with my favorite historian, who I've discussed before, H.W. Brands, who is a prolific writer, and gosh, he has a lot of YouTube videos out there, lectures on all parts of American history that I can recommend. And H.W. Brands wrote a book a year before this on Lincoln and John Brown. And the title of that was The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. And I thought this title really echoes that title. You just plug in different names and a few other words. Okay, I don't mean anything by that. I'm sure that was not, that was accidental. Okay, so here's what H.W. Brands said. Every American historian at some point or another has to come to terms with Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, and that Lincoln is the most written about figure in American history. So new books about Lincoln have to have some kind of angle because so much has been written about him. And so H.W. Brands, his angle was looking at John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, and then Brian Kilmeade's angle was looking at Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. I want to be clear, Brands did not refer ever to Kilmeade's book, but I just thought some of his wisdom we could apply to this. Okay, Brands said interestingly that biographers are generally either historians, like H.W. Brands, or journalists, like Kilmeade. And the historians often start with the times and work their way back to the person. And journalists start with the person and move out to the times. And I think that applies here. And maybe that's why I found this so interesting. It was really focused on Lincoln and Douglas throughout the whole thing. And then from that, we learn more about the Civil War and the times surrounding that. Okay, so there's some background information. Was that enough? Too much? Pretty good? Okay. Now, there's one other thing that I've been thinking of that I just felt I needed to say. You know, when we read books about the American Revolution, we know how it ended, and in a way we just think that was a foregone conclusion. I think that's the same way. Now when we read about World War II, we just think, well, we won that one, and you know, we forget that that was not a foregone conclusion. And I think that's really important here with the Civil War. You know, we're reading it, we know how it ended, but we're experiencing it in this book through Lincoln and Douglas. I mean, they don't know how it's going to end, and it was not a foregone conclusion. You know, just thinking of Lincoln and hearing the stories from his generals, like, oh, we're going to win this battle. Well, we lost. You know, I mean, and you know, and Lincoln was spurring his generals on. Can you know, take action? Can you attack? And they're like, well, in a few days. You know, and so there were these ups and downs we saw through the book, and I thought it was so interesting. Like the Battle of Bull Run, did you read in the book, there were spectators who were having picnics with opera glasses thinking, okay, a battle, and you know, it's going to be interesting and we're going to win. Well, yeah, that was a surprise, and I think, you know, they said Lincoln that night, you know, it opened his eyes, like this is not going to be just an easy war to win. Okay, so I do think that's important to read it through that lens, like they didn't know what was going to happen with that war. Okay, so the book starts with a chapter called From the Bottom Up, and that describes both men's backgrounds. And a footnote from the book here says that Lincoln himself said that his first 2 decades could be summed up as, quote, the short and simple annals of the poor. And he took that quote from a Thomas Gray poem. But, you know, if you haven't read the book, you can read the book, but very, very modest background. He pieced together 1 year of formal schooling, but he read everything he could get his hands on, and his cousin said that he was a constant and voracious reader. He was 21 years when he left the farm and his family. Douglass, who was, his name when we first see him is Frederick Bailey. Of course, he was born to slavery in Maryland. He only had a vague recollection of his mother. He never really knew who his father was or when his birthday was. There was a rumor that his father was his mother's enslaver. At 6, he was relocated to a grand mansion of a former governor of Maryland, but then at 8, he was sent to Baltimore. And he said that Baltimore, being a cosmopolitan city, quote, laid the foundation and opened the gateway to his future. I have Frederick Douglass's I have a passage that he wrote, learning to read and write, that mirrors what is explained in the book, but in a little bit more detail, and it is in Frederick Douglass's words. So he explains how originally the mistress had treated him as a human being and started to instruct him in the alphabet until the husband was like, "What are you doing? You know, you cannot teach a slave to read." And then he said her tender heart became like a stone, all teaching stopped. And so a few things he said about that is slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities that she had possessed. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. And then, but then he really was clever, resourceful, strong, and he said at that time he would be sent on errands, and he always took his book with him, and he would get his errands done quickly and find time to have a little bit of time with his book. He also brought bread with him, as mentioned in this book, and he said he would bestow this bread upon hungry little urchins who in return would give him that valuable bread of knowledge. So, and he tricked some people into teaching them how to read. But what was interesting, he said, as I read, as I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontent which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning had already come to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. So, so he had wisdom, and that was not always a blessing. But I think that's what spurred him to escape. Okay, escaping to freedom, there's a little chapter here you can read, starts on page 26. It describes how he made friends among the Baltimore's free black population. He met and married a free woman of color, Anna. They planned his, quote, departure to a new life. So he escaped, he got a new life, he changed his name, and he became Frederick Douglass. They settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Okay. So that in itself, I mean, we could talk about Lincoln's and Douglass's early years. So interesting. The humble beginnings, where they started and where they ended, is quite the story. But we have a limited time here, so I'm going to fast forward to the Civil War. Okay, a lot of these ideas about the Civil War came from that lecture I saw from H.W. Grant's. So there is the reoccurring question, which we still hear over and over again: was the Civil War about slavery or states' rights? And H.W. Brand says it was about both, and it's not like the Civil War just started with the snap of a finger. He said as early as 1790, there were questions about what to do when the federal government overstepped its power. So there was a long period of debate on this topic before the slavery question. But the 11 southern states that left thought our rights are in danger. Our rights are in danger if we're in the Union. And the right they were referring to was slavery. And so they believed they had the right to leave the Union over any cause. Lincoln believed the Constitution did not allow the states to leave the Union, period. It was not for him at that point about slavery. It was just, they cannot leave the Union. So for the first 1.5 years of the war, Lincoln consistently said the war is about states' rights. Now, in this book, we see how his views evolved over time. We see the pressures he faced from all sides on making that progress. The book refers to Lincoln's letter to Horace Greeley, who is an editor of a newspaper. And it's famous, I know you've heard it before, but I'm going to read it again because I just think it's, again, Lincoln's own words. Okay. I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be, quote, the Union as it was. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I'm doing hurts the cause. I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. I shall try to correct errors when shown to be errors. I shall adopt new views so fast they shall appear to be true views. Okay, I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. In other words, my job is to save the Union. That's what at that point, that's what he cared about. And that's why, Frederick Douglass would see glimmers of hope, and then they would be dashed. But gradually realized that in order to save the Union, he would need to offer freedom to some slaves. About that time, I think, you hear the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation. Those two, I guess the proclamation wasn't necessarily a speech that he gave, but those two documents elevated the discussion and made the Civil War more about civil rights than just keeping the Union together. Lincoln revered the Constitution. It is what held the country together. He was a stickler in the constitutional powers of the president. He was a lawyer. He, was learned in that way. And so he didn't really think he had the power to free slaves except as a war measure. So in that Emancipation Proclamation, it offered freedom to the slaves of the Confederate masters, not the slaves in the border states. And he just couldn't lose Maryland and those border states. That would be the end. And how he did it is slaves were considered property in the South. And during war, commanders could seize enemy property. And it was done all the time. Now, that would not be a lasting solution, but it would be a short-term solution. And again, we see that evolve. So finally, Lincoln concluded that he had to make the end of slavery a war aim of the Union. took him a while to get there. Okay, and then something that might interest all of us is how Lincoln became more obviously religious as the war went on. Before the war, his position was there is a God, but as the war went on, he would talk about God's providence. He would talk about heaven. He would talk about how God could stop the war. And so we see that in the second inaugural address, which Kilmeade describes as having religious reverence. And I have part of it. Now, the part that we've heard, I brought it up on my phone. The part that we're all familiar with is where it says, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with fairness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have won the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all nations. So we're all familiar with that. It's a very short speech. It's interesting. He made 3 speeches he was so well known for: the second inaugural address, the Gettysburg address, and the first inaugural address, and they were all very short. So, I mean, you could go back and read this, but there is so much more in here about God, and I just thought I would read a little bit of it. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was sometimes the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible, prayed to the same God. Each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we not be judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. And it goes on. But, wow. Okay. Now that's a lot about Lincoln. Let me just say a little bit about Frederick Douglass. Okay, he was an important central figure on his own. He was an escaped slave, one of the best known abolitionists of the time, a testament to what black people could accomplish with education and freedom. His gifts were as a writer and an orator, not as a fighter. So there was that chapter in the book where John Brown wanted him to participate in the raid in Harper's Ferry, and he was torn because he believed in that cause, but he just thought, you know, that's not me. I cannot do that. And he probably rightly saw that the end result was not going to go well there. The book, throughout the book, it highlights Douglass's hopefulness and Lincoln's positions and plans, only to be discouraged and disappointed. The book describes where Douglass was enraged with one of Lincoln's proposals. He called Lincoln, quote, a genuine representative of American prejudice. For me, the most moving parts of the book is where Kilmeade describes the times where they met. And here's just one quick little passage on page 181. Okay, so on page 181, moments from meeting the president for the first time, Douglass did not know what to expect. For years, he'd been writing and speaking publicly about Lincoln's politics and positions, and more often than not, his remarks were highly critical. His personal feelings about the man fluctuated between hopeful and impatient, exhilarated and angry. Lincoln wielded immense power and at last had done right with the Emancipation Proclamation, yet at other times he fell short of Douglass's expectations. So when they met, Lincoln rose laboriously from the low chair. On reaching his full height, he extended his hand in cordial welcome. As they shook, Douglass again was struck by Lincoln's face. This time, as he wrote to Stearns the next day, I saw at a glance the justice of the popular estimate of his qualities expressed in the prefix honest to the name of Abraham Lincoln. I had never seen a more transparent countenance. Okay, and he talked about how Lincoln listened patiently to every word, then responded in measured and thoughtful ways. And then that last meeting where right after the second inaugural address, and Lincoln saw Douglass in the audience, and then later Douglass came to the White House. He went to the receiving line, and they tried to say he was not allowed there, but he was like, just tell him I'm here. And then they ushered him in to see Lincoln. Lincoln stopped what he was doing to go approach Frederick Douglass, and he said, Douglass, I saw you in the crowd today listening to my inaugural address. How did you like it? And he said, Mr. Lincoln, I must not detain you with my poor opinion when there are thousands waiting to shake hands with you. But in this very public moment, the president wanted more from his new friend. You must stop a little, Douglass. There is no one in the country whose opinion I value more than yours. And he said, Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort. I mean, now we know what was coming, just like right down after that, but what a beautiful moment where they came together at that point. And then we hear that after Lincoln's death, former slaves raised money for a freedman's memorial, and Douglass spoke at that. And did you all see that footnote on that page? I'm going to read the footnote to you. So in the crowd was people from all three parts of our government, and it said, as Douglass's biographer David Blight has pointed out, another 133 years would elapse before a second black man could lay claim to so distinguished an audience. That was in 2009 when Barack Obama delivered his first inaugural speech. And anyway, so he said, he talked about Lincoln, and again, he said at the ceremony, you are the children of Abraham. We are at best only his stepchildren. Yet, and it said, yet he had made peace with Lincoln's slow rise to the cause of freeing the black man. And then Douglass spent an hour delivering his history lesson, praising Lincoln, speaking respectfully of his memory, but he refused to do the 16th president the disservice of reducing him, as history had already begun to do, to a saintly and uncomplicated figure out of sheer goodness of his heart and its slavery. Douglass knew Lincoln as a man of complex and shifting intellect. And he said, Douglass said, what we need to do of Lincoln is to remember. He needs to be remembered fully. Okay, now, as I talked to my sister this morning and told her that I was coming to talk about this book, and then just moments before I left my house, she texted me something that is perfect timing, that evidently there is a new documentary on Frederick Douglass. And it's coming out, like maybe tonight, I don't know, but here's, okay, on PBS, so this is perfect timing. So Douglass's bold vision of America takes on fresh relevance today as PBS premieres a new documentary about his life by Oscar-nominated filmmaker Stanley Nelson, entitled Becoming Frederick Douglass. The film looks at how a man born into slavery became one of the nation's most influential leaders. Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century. 160 photographs of him survive, compared to 130 of Abraham Lincoln. The documentary is filled with memorable moments. It retraces many pivotal moments in Douglass's life, how he traded biscuits as a boy with white playmates to learn how to read, the crucial contributions of his first wife, his legendary 2-hour fight with an overseer, and a recreation of his famed 4th of July speech. The film suggests that Douglass's facility with words was just as important as his physical courage in taking on the institution of slavery. No political figure, not even Abraham Lincoln, talked that way about the U.S. in the mid to late 19th century. quote, he was speaking for a multiracial, diverse America in the 1860s. He was absolutely alone. I can't think of another public figure who took such an unequivocal position as he did. Douglass's vision of America as a multi-hued beacon of global liberty still looms ahead us like a rhetorical North Star. So, I mean, how is that this is so relevant still today? So I think it's great to read the history, to be reminded of the time and his life and how it intersected with Lincoln's, and the struggles they both went through, but they're both still relevant today, so maybe we can watch that documentary on PBS tonight. Okay, do y'all have any questions or comments, things that you noticed in the book? Yes.
Well, Douglass spent so much time in Europe and was so accepted as a public speaker that he was more visible to the world than Abraham Lincoln.
That's a very good point. And there were times, I think they said, when Douglass thought, should I just stay in Europe? But then as history progressed, he thought, I've got to get back there. Yeah, because life was easier for him in Europe, and he was well known. And how I didn't know he was the most photographed person of the century, more than Abraham Lincoln, as you said. What else? Anything else that struck y'all? It's just, I mean,
his afro, his haircut was what I've been aware of him for ages.
yes, those pictures of him with the dramatic hair, and I think they said it was white, or it was turning gray or white, that dramatic.
It's just wild.
Yes, yes. And then the pictures of Lincoln too, and they said that he had lost 20 pounds, just into his presidency, just how gaunt he was and burdened. All right, anything else? Okay. Well, I really enjoyed the book, and I just, even though probably many of us knew much of this, it's so good to be reminded of it, to read it again in context with Frederick Douglass, and just to be reminded of how the ending of the war, our victory was not assured by the Union. Okay, good. Thank you.
Martha.